Dark skies, vanishing planes, missing children, mysterious killers, and secrets buried in the shadows of America's past. Some stories refuse to rest. From the disappearance of Amelia Earhart to the chilling codes of the Zodiac, these unsolved mysteries shaped history and still spark debate decades later. Tonight, we're digging into 25 of the most haunting American mysteries from the 1930s to the 1960s. Cases that continue to puzzle investigators, historians, and everyday people alike. Some may never be solved, but each holds a chilling question. How much of the truth is still out there, waiting to be uncovered? 1. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan vanish. 1937. In July of 1937, Amelia Earhart, already a global icon as the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, set out on what she hoped would be her greatest achievement, a round-the-world flight at the equator. Beside her was navigator Fred Noonan, a respected pilot in his own right. Their twin-engine Lockheed Electra lifted off from Lae, New Guinea on July 2nd, bound for a tiny speck of land in the Pacific. Howland Island, a remote U.S. outpost barely 2 miles long. The flight, roughly 2,500 miles over open ocean, was expected to take about 20 hours. They never arrived. From the start, the journey was fraught with challenges. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed near Howland to guide the Electra with radio signals and be ready for an emergency landing. But communications were inconsistent, full of static, and plagued by mismatched frequencies. Earhart's voice was heard, sometimes faint and sometimes strong, but her position reports grew increasingly uncertain. Near the end, she radioed that they were running on line 157-337, aviation shorthand for a navigational path, and added the chilling words, "We are running north and south." That was the last confirmed transmission anyone heard. What happened next is where the mystery begins. The simplest explanation, endorsed by the official U.S. investigation, is that Earhart and Noonan simply ran out of fuel, crashed into the Pacific, and sank beneath the waves. It is plausible. Their plane had a limited range. The island was small and difficult to spot, and a navigational error could have been fatal. Yet, despite decades of searches, no conclusive wreckage has ever been found. This lack of physical evidence has fueled one of history's most enduring puzzles. Alternative theories abound. Some suggest that Earhart and Noonan may have diverted to the Phoenix Islands, now part of Kiribati, particularly Nikumaroro, where castaway evidence has occasionally surfaced. Bones discovered there in 1940 were initially dismissed as male, but, in later re-examinations, alive in popular imagination. Still others point to the idea that their fate was deliberately covered up, either to conceal intelligence activities or because the government did not want to admit failures in the search and rescue. Nearly every decade, new documents, photographs, and declassified files emerge, but none have closed the case once and for all. Modern search teams, armed with sonar, deep-sea drones, and satellite data, have scoured large swaths of ocean floor around Howland and Nikumaroro, often raising funds through public campaigns. Each expedition brings back intriguing leads, sonar blips, metal fragments, but never the definitive proof that would solve the mystery. For Americans in the 1930s, Earhart's disappearance was more than a tragic loss. She had embodied courage, progress, and possibility at a time when the nation was struggling through the Great Depression. To lose her without answers left a deep cultural scar. The press followed every rumor. People across the world clung to the hope she might have survived somewhere. Even today, her story remains a powerful mix of triumph and tragedy, an unfinished chapter in the history of exploration. And that is why the case of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan endures as perhaps the greatest aviation mystery of the 20th century. To this day, divers, scientists, and enthusiasts continue the search, driven by the belief that somewhere out there, on the ocean floor or buried on a remote atoll, The truth is waiting to be uncovered. Yet as one door closes, another mystery from the same era opens. Just 3 years before Earhart vanished, another high-profile figure in America disappeared into thin air, this time not in the skies, but in the bustling streets of New York City. 2. The missingest man in New York. Judge Joseph Crater, 1930. On the night of August 6, 1930, a well-dressed man hailed a cab on West 45th Street in Manhattan and vanished into history. That man was Joseph Force Crater, a 41-year-old associate justice of the New York Supreme Court, known in the papers as the Playboy Judge. His disappearance, coming at the height of a citywide crackdown on corruption, earned him a darker and more enduring nickname, the missingest man in New York. Crater's life before his vanishing already had the makings of a political drama. Appointed to the bench only months earlier by Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, Crater was a rising figure in Democratic Party circles. He was well connected to Tammany Hall, the powerful political machine that ran much of New York's politics, and he enjoyed the high life, Broadway shows, expensive dinners, and glamorous companions. To the public, he looked like a man who had everything, but behind the scenes, pressures were building. Investigations into corruption and judicial appointments were underway, and Crater himself had begun quietly moving money around. On that August day, Crater spent the morning in his chambers reviewing cases. In the afternoon, he went to his Fifth Avenue apartment, where his wife Stella was away at their summer home in Maine. Crater instructed his chauffeur to withdraw several $1,000s from his bank account, and he visited his office to sort through files and remove some papers. Around 9 p.m., he dined with a lawyer friend and a Broadway showgirl at a popular restaurant near Times Square. After dinner, he said he was heading to see a show. He stepped into a cab and was never seen again. Theories about what happened to Judge Crater flooded the city. The simplest suggested he may have fled under pressure. The sudden withdrawal of cash, the mysterious papers he removed from his office, and his entanglements with powerful figures all seemed to suggest a man preparing to disappear on his own terms. But if he had indeed staged his own vanishing, why was there never any credible sighting, dispute, or financial betrayal? Yet again, hard evidence was absent. For weeks after his disappearance, newspapers splashed the story across their front pages. Tips poured in from across the country. Crater spotted in Atlantic City. Crater in the South. Crater living abroad under an assumed name. None checked out. The police investigation dragged on for months, then years, and eventually dwindled into one of the coldest of cold cases. His wife Stella, desperate for answers, held on to hope for a time. In later years, she became bitter at what she saw as political indifference to solving the case. In 1939, 9 years after he vanished, Judge Crater was officially declared legally dead. By then, his name had already become part of American slang. For decades afterward, whenever someone went missing, New Yorkers would quip, "Pulled a Crater." The mystery took a final twist in 2005, when a handwritten note surfaced after the death of a Queens woman. The note claimed that her late husband, a city police officer, knew where Crater's body had been buried, under a section of the Coney Island boardwalk. According to the story, Crater had been murdered by men tied to organized crime and construction rackets. Skeptics dismissed the claim as folklore, but to others, it was the closest thing to an answer the city would ever get. Nearly a century later, the fate of Joseph Force Crater remains unresolved. His story captures the intersection of politics, corruption, glamour, and secrecy in Depression-era New York. The absence of closure, the lack of a body, a confession, or a clear motive ensures that his disappearance still lingers in the American imagination. And if the unexplained vanishing of a powerful judge could shake a city, the doubts surrounding another headline-making case just a couple of years later would grip the entire nation: the kidnapping of the most famous baby in America. 3. The Lindbergh baby case doubts, 1932. Few events in American history have captured both heartbreak and controversy, quite like the case of Charles Lindbergh Jr., the 20-month-old son of Charles Lindbergh, the aviator, celebrated as a national hero for his 1927 solo flight across the Atlantic. On the evening of March 1, 1932, the toddler was reported missing from the Lindbergh family's home in Hopewell, New Jersey. What followed became one of the most heavily covered crime stories of the century. A frantic search, ransom negotiations, and eventually the arrest and execution of a suspect. Yet even after all that, debate about what really happened has never been put to rest. On that chilly night, Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne discovered their son's crib, empty. A ransom note demanding $50,000 was found on the nursery windowsill, and a makeshift ladder was discovered nearby. The story exploded in the press almost immediately. Americans followed every development in newspapers and on the radio, horrified that the child of their national icon had been taken. The family was bombarded with letters, both genuine and fraudulent, from people claiming to know the child's whereabouts. Negotiations eventually led to a ransom payment being made in marked bills. Despite this, the child was not returned. Several weeks later, the remains of a small child were found in a wooded area a few miles from the Lindbergh estate. Identified as Charles Jr., the nation mourned, and attention turned to finding the perpetrator. The breakthrough seemed to come in 1934, when Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant carpenter living in the Bronx, was arrested. He had been caught using some of the ransom money, and police claimed wood in his attic matched the ladder left at the crime scene. The trial that followed was dubbed the trial of the century, and it transfixed the public. Hauptmann was convicted of kidnapping and murder, and in 1936, he was executed in the electric chair. For many, justice had been served. But almost immediately, cracks appeared in the official narrative. Critics argued that much of the evidence was circumstantial or flawed. For example, the ladder wood analysis, central to the case, was based on forensic methods that would later be questioned for their reliability. Handwriting experts. More troubling were lingering questions about whether Hauptmann could have acted alone. Some investigators and authors have suggested that others were involved, possibly insiders who knew the Lindbergh household routine. Theories range from organized crime connections to speculation that someone within the household itself may have played a role, though no conclusive evidence has ever supported these claims. Calls for modern forensic testing have persisted into the 21st century. Advocates for a reinvestigation argue that DNA analysis of the ransom notes, ladder, or other physical evidence might settle some of the doubts once and for all. Yet legal and bureaucratic barriers have largely prevented these tests from being carried out. For historians, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts, the case remains a stark reminder of how justice in a media-saturated environment can become clouded by public opinion and political pressure. The Lindbergh case changed American life in lasting ways. It led directly to the passage of the Federal Kidnapping Act, often called the Lindbergh Law, which made kidnapping a federal crime if the victim was taken across state lines. The FBI also expanded its role in national investigations, partly in response to this case. In that sense, the tragedy reshaped the country's approach to law enforcement. Yet despite the passage of time, questions linger. Was Bruno Hauptmann truly guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Did he have accomplices, or was he perhaps innocent, condemned by a rush to satisfy the public's demand for justice? These uncertainties ensure the Lindbergh baby case remains an open wound in America's legal history, an unsolved mystery in spirit, if not in the courtroom. And as Americans struggled with those doubts, another terror was taking shape in the very heart of Depression-era Cleveland, where a shadowy killer stalked the streets and left behind one of the most gruesome chains of unsolved murders in U.S. history. 4. Cleveland Torso Murderer, 1935 to 1938. In the depths of the Great Depression, Cleveland, Ohio was already struggling with unemployment, crime, and a sense of despair when a series of grisly discoveries shocked the city. Between 1935 and 1938, at least a dozen dismembered bodies were found in and around the Kingsbury Run area, a rough neighborhood known for shantytowns and transient populations. Newspapers quickly dubbed the unknown assailant the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, though today he is more commonly referred to as the Cleveland Torso Murderer. Despite massive police efforts, including a direct investigation by the legendary lawman Eliot Ness, the killer was never identified, leaving the case as one of the most chilling mysteries in American criminal history. The first known victim was discovered in September 1935 when two teenage boys stumbled upon a headless body near the Run. The brutality of the crime made headlines, but it was only the beginning. Over the next 3 years, more victims, often decapitated and dismembered, were found in vacant lots, dumps, and the riverbanks of Cleveland. Most of the victims were men, many believed to be drifters or individuals living on society's margins. Because they often lacked strong community ties, identifying the bodies proved difficult. The scale and consistency of the crimes made it clear that this was the work of a single individual, someone both methodical and ruthless. The police were under enormous pressure, not only from the public but also from the press, which seized on every detail to fuel the story. Cleveland's mayor at the time, Harold Burton, pushed for swift action, and he turned to Eliot Ness, already famous as the prohibition agent who helped bring down Al Capone in Chicago, to help solve the case. Ness, by then serving as Cleveland's safety director, launched one of the largest manhunts the city had ever seen. His investigators combed through hospitals, morgues, and criminal records. They interviewed hundreds of suspects and carried out raids on shantytowns where the killer was thought to prowl. Ness even went so far away, or simply changed methods to avoid detection. Because so many of the victims were never identified, it is possible there were even more cases linked to the torso murderer than the dozen or so that were officially recorded. Each time new evidence surfaces, be it a fresh review of old files or a forensic re-examination, interest in the case spikes again. But the central questions remain unanswered. For Cleveland, the murders left a permanent scar. They underscored the vulnerability of those living on society's edges, people who could vanish without much notice. They also showed the limits of law enforcement at the time. Even with a nationally renowned figure like Ness at the helm, the case proved too elusive. The identity of the Cleveland torso murderer has never been solved, and the case remains one of America's most infamous, unsolved serial murder mysteries. It also set the stage for later cold cases in U.S. history, where communities were haunted not just by the crimes themselves, but by the absence of resolution. And as Cleveland lived under the shadow of an unknown predator, another community, hundreds of miles away, would be gripped by fear in the mid-1940s when a faceless attacker began haunting the lovers' lanes of Texarkana, leaving behind a mystery that endures to this day. 5. Texarkana Phantom Killer, 1946. In the spring of 1946, just months after World War II had ended, the quiet twin cities of Texarkana, straddling the border of Texas and Arkansas, were thrown into a state of fear by a series of brutal nighttime attacks. Newspapers dubbed the unknown assailant the Phantom Killer or Phantom Slayer, a shadowy figure said to stalk young couples parked on lovers' lanes or driving along rural roads. Over the course of roughly 10 weeks, at least 5 people were killed and several others injured. Despite an enormous manhunt and nationwide press attention, the killer was never caught, and his identity remains one of America's enduring criminal mysteries. The first known attack occurred on February 22, 1946, when a young couple, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry, were ambushed while parked in a secluded area after a movie. Both survived, though badly injured, and they described their assailant as a man wearing a white cloth mask over his face, with holes cut for the eyes and mouth. The description evoked a terrifying, almost ghostly image, which fueled the Phantom nickname in the press. The attacks escalated. On March 24th, Richard Griffin and his girlfriend Polly Ann Moore were found dead in their car near a lover's lane. Just weeks later, on April 14th, teenager Paul Martin and 15-year-old Betty Jo Booker were murdered after attending a dance. The killings were ruthless, and the randomness of the victims, ordinary young people simply out enjoying the evening, shook the community. The final confirmed attack took place on May 3rd, when a farmer and his wife were assaulted at their rural home. The husband, Virgil Starks, was killed, but his wife managed to escape despite serious injuries. Her testimony helped confirm that the same shadowy figure was likely behind the series of crimes. By then, Texarkana was in a state of panic. Nighttime activity in the cities slowed to a crawl. Residents stayed indoors, locked their doors, and armed themselves. Theaters closed early, and stores reported brisk sales of firearms. The Phantom Killer was more than just a criminal. He was a presence haunting an entire region. Law enforcement kept speculation alive for decades. Some argue the Phantom was a local man who blended back into society after the attacks stopped. Others suspect the crimes may have been committed by multiple individuals, though the patterns of the attacks suggest otherwise. With no definitive suspect, every theory remains open, from the likely to the outlandish. The Texarkana Phantom case has lived on in popular culture, inspiring urban legends, books, and even horror films such as The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Yet for the families of the victims, the story is more than a legend. It is a tragedy without resolution. The murders robbed young people of their lives, and a community of its peace of mind. What makes the Phantom Killer case so haunting is not only the brutality of the attacks, but also the way they seem to come out of nowhere and vanish just as suddenly. After May 1946, the murders ceased. Was the killer arrested for another crime? Did he move away? Or did he simply choose to stop? With the passage of time, answers have grown less likely, and the shadows around Texarkana remain. But even as the Phantom disappeared from the headlines, another case on the other side of the country would seize America's imagination. The shocking and still unsolved Hollywood murder that came to be known as the Black Dahlia. 6. The Black Dahlia, 1947. In January 1947, Los Angeles was already a city of contradictions. Hollywood projected glamour and optimism across the nation, while behind the scenes, the city wrestled with organized crime, corruption, and a swelling population adjusting to post-war life. It was in this atmosphere that one of America's most infamous unsolved murders took place, the case of Elizabeth Short, later immortalized in headlines as the Black Dahlia. The crime shocked the city, dominated national news, and has remained an unsolved riddle for more than 75 years. Elizabeth Short was a 22-year-old aspiring actress from Massachusetts who had come to California with dreams of making it in Hollywood. Friends described her as striking, with jet black hair and a fondness for stylish clothing, often wearing black outfits that accentuated her pale complexion. This look, combined with a popular film at the time called The Blue Dahlia, led the press to dub her the Black Dahlia once the story broke. Though she had struggled to find steady work and lived a somewhat transient life, moving between acquaintances' apartments and hotels, Short embodied the hopes of many young women who flocked to Los Angeles in search of stardom. On January 15, 1947, her body was discovered in a vacant lot in a residential neighborhood south of Hollywood. The shocking nature of the scene ensured instant notoriety, and newspapers swarmed the case, printing lurid details that fueled both fascination and fear. The Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, launched what would become one of its largest investigations, interviewing hundreds of potential witnesses and suspects. The case files eventually ballooned into thousands of pages, but despite the massive effort, no one was ever charged. Why did this case in particular lodge so firmly in the public imagination? Part of the reason lies in the timing and setting. Post-war Los Angeles was a city of dreams colliding with reality. The gap between Hollywood's glittering image and the grittier lives of those chasing fame created fertile ground for both sympathy and sensationalism. Elizabeth Short's youth, beauty, and ambitions made her detective. Later argued that his father fit the profile of the killer. While intriguing, the theory, like so many others, remains unproven. The LAPD still lists the case as open, though practical chances of solving it diminish with every passing decade. Forensic science in 1947 lacked the tools available today, and much of the physical evidence has been lost or degraded over time. Nonetheless, every few years a new book, podcast, or film revives public interest, each promising to reveal the truth, but leaving the mystery intact. The Black Dahlia case endures not just because of its brutality, but because it symbolizes the darker undercurrent of the American dream. Los Angeles in the 1940s promised opportunity and fame, but it also fostered anonymity, exploitation, and danger. Elizabeth Short's story has become a haunting reminder of that duality. And just as Los Angeles was left reeling from that unsolved crime, another unexplained event that same year would stir both fear and wonder. This time not on the ground, but in the skies over California, where citizens and the military found themselves facing a spectacle that defied easy explanation. The so-called Battle of Los Angeles. 7. The Battle of Los Angeles, 1942. In the early hours of February 25, 1942, just a few months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Los Angeles residents were jolted awake by air raid sirens and the thunder of anti-aircraft fire. Searchlights cut across the night sky, beams crisscrossing in frantic patterns as guns on the coast and in the hills launched over 1,400 rounds into the darkness. To many on the ground, it looked as though the city was under direct assault. Rumors spread instantly. Japanese bombers had reached California, or perhaps German aircraft had come by way of South America. The chaos that night became known as the Battle of Los Angeles, a battle in which no enemy was ever found. The timing of the event is crucial to understanding the fear. It was just weeks after Pearl Harbor when Americans on the West Coast were bracing for the possibility of an attack. Submarines had been spotted off the California coast. And earlier that day, the U.S. military announced that defense forces were on alert. So when radar picked up an unidentified object off Los Angeles around 2 a.m., the military reacted with urgency. Within minutes, the skies lit up as coastal artillery opened fire. Residents poured into the streets or huddled in their homes, watching in awe and terror as the skies filled with smoke and shrapnel. Newspapers the next day carried dramatic photographs showing searchlights converging on glowing shapes in the sky, images that only deepened the mystery. Witnesses swore they saw aircraft. Some claimed dozens maneuvering through the fire. Others insisted they saw nothing but smoke illuminated by spotlights. When daylight came, there was no wreckage, no enemy planes, and no sign of an attack. What then had prompted such a massive display of firepower? The official explanation from the Navy was that it had been a false alarm triggered by war nerves, and possibly a weather balloon. Critics, however, were not convinced. The sheer scale of the anti-aircraft barrage, coupled with multiple eyewitness accounts describing objects moving in formation, left many skeptical that it was all just a balloon and nerves. Over the years, theories have ranged widely. Some historians argue it really was a case of false alarm. Why did so many people insist they saw shapes in the sky? If it was an attack, why was there no evidence of enemy aircraft? And if it was something else entirely, why has the truth never come to light? What is certain is that the night underscored how fear and uncertainty can grip a nation. At a moment when the Pacific coast was vulnerable, the people of Los Angeles were thrust into what felt like a real war zone, even if the enemy never materialized. The strange affair soon faded from headlines as the war intensified elsewhere. But it has never been forgotten. For some, it remains an example of mass hysteria. For others, it is a tantalizing brush with the unexplained. And just as the skies over Los Angeles left Americans puzzled, another aerial mystery would unfold only months later. This time, involving a U.S. Navy blimp that set out on a routine mission, but returned without its crew, sparking questions that remain unanswered to this day.
8. The L-8 Ghost Blimp, 1942. On the morning of August 16, 1942, residents of Daly City, California looked up in surprise as a U.S. Navy blimp drifted silently toward the ground. The airship, designated L-8, carried the markings of the Navy's Mighty Midgets Squadron and was part of routine coastal patrols meant to spot enemy submarines off the Pacific coast. To those on the ground, it looked like an accident in progress, but not an unusual one during wartime. When the blimp came down, it was damaged, but mostly intact. What stunned Navy investigators, however, was that the gondola, the crew compartment, was empty. The two-man crew, Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody and Ensign Charles Adams, had vanished. The flight had begun uneventfully. Cody and Adams departed Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay early that morning, with orders to patrol a 50-mile sector of the coastline. They carried standard gear, life vests, parachutes, and emergency supplies. Weather conditions were favorable, and both men were experienced aviators. At around 7:42 a.m., Cody radioed that they had spotted an oil slick near the Farallon Islands, possibly a sign of a submarine. That was the last confirmed transmission from L-8. Hours later, the blimp was seen drifting inland. By then, its engines were still running, but the craft was moving erratically. Witnesses reported seeing it skim rooftops and drag across telephone wires before finally coming down in Daly City. When Navy personnel and civilians reached the airship, they were startled to find the cockpit empty. Cody and Adams were gone. Inside the gondola, everything appeared in order. The radio worked, parachutes were still aboard, and the life raft remained untouched. The safety belts had not been fastened at the time of departure, suggesting the men had not prepared to abandon ship. Most puzzling of all, the cabin door was latched open, something unusual for flight. If the men had fallen, why hadn't they used parachutes? If they had ditched into the sea, why were there no signs of distress? Investigators scoured of the strange incident, carrying out routine patrols with no further problems. But the fate of Cody and Adams was never determined, and their disappearance remains one of the most baffling aviation mysteries of the era. In the context of wartime America, the ghost blimp incident symbolized how even in the midst of high-tech defense and constant vigilance, the unknown could still intrude. It also fed into the growing list of unsolved aerial puzzles that captured the public's imagination during the 1940s. And as curious as the mystery of the missing airmen was, an even larger and more haunting case would soon unfold, this time involving not one craft but an entire squadron of planes that vanished over the Atlantic, a story that helped give rise to the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. 9. Flight 19, Bermuda Triangle, 1945. On December 5, 1945, 5 U.S. Navy Avenger torpedo bombers lifted off from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on what should have been a routine training exercise. Known as Flight 19, the squadron carried 14 crew members in total and was tasked with practicing navigation and bombing runs over the Atlantic. The weather was fair, and the mission was considered straightforward. Yet within hours, all 5 planes disappeared, sparking one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century and helping cement the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. The exercise began around 2:10 p.m. under the command of Lieutenant Charles Taylor, an experienced pilot who had flown combat missions in World War II. The flight plan called for a simple triangular route, east from Florida for a bombing run over an island, then north, and finally back west to base. For reasons still debated, things went wrong after the bombing exercise. Radio transmissions later revealed growing confusion among the pilots. Taylor reported that his compasses were malfunctioning and that he was unsure of his position. He believed he was over the Florida Keys, when in fact he was likely northeast of the Bahamas. His miscalculation caused the squadron to veer further out into the Atlantic, instead of turning back toward Florida. As the hours passed, radio operators on land picked up increasingly frantic messages.
Fuel was running low. Visibility was worsening, and the pilots were unsure where to fly. Despite attempts to guide them home, communication grew sporadic. The final message came around 7:04 p.m., when Taylor reported that the planes would have to ditch in the sea if they couldn't find land. After that, silence. The Navy launched one of the largest search and rescue efforts in its history. More than 300 aircraft and 21 ships combed the waters. To add to the tragedy, a PBM Mariner rescue plane dispatched to aid the search also vanished with its 13-man crew. Witnesses later reported seeing a mid-air explosion, suggesting that the Mariner may have suffered a fuel leak and exploded. Still, the time
Sudden storms or rogue waves as explanations. Others have reached for more exotic ideas, from extraterrestrial abductions to time warps. While such theories capture the imagination, most historians point to human error, equipment failure, and the difficulty of navigation over vast stretches of ocean as the likeliest causes. Still, the lack of tangible evidence continues to fascinate. Aviation historians note that Avenger bombers were rugged planes designed to withstand heavy fire in wartime. For 5 to vanish simultaneously, without leaving wreckage, stretches the imagination. Even in recent decades, underwater searches with advanced sonar have failed to locate the squadron. The disappearance of Flight 19 has become more than just a military mishap. It is a symbol of the ocean's enduring power to confound and conceal. It reminds us that even in an age of radar and radio, nature and human error can combine in ways that defy resolution. And just as the Atlantic stirred fears with this mystery, another event 2 years later would ignite a different kind of speculation, when strange debris found on a ranch in New Mexico gave rise to decades of debate about what really fell from the skies at Roswell. 10. The Roswell Incident, 1947. In the summer of 1947, the small desert town of Roswell, New Mexico, became the center of one of the most famous and debated mysteries in American history. It all began when rancher William Mack Brazel discovered strange debris scattered across his land after a storm. The materials included metallic fragments, lightweight strips that resisted burning, and pieces that some witnesses later claimed were unlike anything they had ever seen. Brazel reported his find to the local sheriff, who in turn notified the nearby Roswell Army Airfield. What followed would ignite decades of speculation, government secrecy claims, and endless debate over whether humanity had its first encounter with visitors from beyond the Earth. On July 8, 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield issued a stunning press release. They had recovered a flying disc. Newspapers across the country seized on the story, and for a brief moment, the mystery seemed to confirm that something extraordinary had fallen from the sky. Yet within a day, the Army changed its account, now stating that the debris came from nothing more than a weather balloon. Photographs were circulated showing military officials displaying balloon remnants, including rubber material and tinfoil-like pieces. The sudden reversal fueled suspicion that the military was hiding the truth. For years, the Roswell incident faded into relative obscurity. But in the late 1970s, when former military personnel and local witnesses began speaking out, interest reignited. Testimonies emerged claiming that the debris was far stranger than weather balloon materials, describing unusual metals, symbols etched into fragments, and even accounts of additional wreckage sites. Some went further, alleging that alien bodies had been recovered and secretly transported to military facilities. Though such claims remain unverified, they became central to the Roswell legend. In the 1990s, the U.S. Air Force declassified documents explaining that the debris had actually come from Project Mogul, a top-secret program designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests using high-altitude balloons carrying sensitive microphones. According to this explanation, the unusual materials were consistent with experimental balloon equipment. While this clarified some of the mystery, it did not satisfy all skeptics. Roswell in 1947 If it was merely Project Mogul, why did the military issue its initial flying disc announcement? Was it simple miscommunication or an attempt to distract the public before a cover-up? And if it was truly something more, why has no definitive evidence surfaced in the decades since? The Roswell incident persists because it represents a collision of secrecy, science, and imagination. In the tense years of the early Cold War, Americans were already primed to suspect both enemy powers and otherworldly phenomena. Roswell became the canvas onto which both fears and hopes were projected. And while the desert winds carried away the dust of Roswell, another story of disappearance was unfolding elsewhere in America. In a quiet West Virginia town, a house fire left unanswered questions that haunt investigators and families to this day. The mysterious case of the Sodder children. 11. The Sodder children, 1945. On Christmas Eve in 1945, the Sodder family of Fayetteville, West Virginia, gathered in their home for what was meant to be a joyful holiday celebration. George and Jenny Sodder lived with their 9 surviving children in a 2-story wood frame house. That night, after gifts were opened and festivities settled down, most of the children went to bed. Just a few hours later, tragedy struck. A fire consumed the house, leaving behind questions that have never been fully answered. 5 of the Sodder children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were never seen again. At first glance, the case looked like a heartbreaking accident. The fire appeared to have destroyed the house so completely that the children's remains could not be recovered. Yet as the days and weeks unfolded, inconsistencies mounted. Those gaps, along with the family's own suspicions, transformed the story from a personal tragedy into one of America's most perplexing unsolved mysteries. The fire broke out shortly after midnight on December 25th. George and Jenny managed to escape along with 4 of their children. They tried desperately to save the others, but obstacles kept them from re-entering the house. A ladder that George always kept propped against the house was missing. The trucks, which George thought he could use to climb or reach the children, mysteriously failed to start. Even a nearby water barrel was frozen solid, rendering it useless. The family could only watch as flames consumed their home. In the aftermath, investigators initially suggested faulty wiring as the cause of the blaze. However, George had recently had the home's wiring inspected, and no problems were found. More troubling was the lack of physical evidence. Fire experts testified that human remains, bones, teeth, some trace of the children, should have been found, even in a fire of that magnitude. Yet the official search turned up nothing. Strange details further fueled doubt. Jenny reported hearing something hit the roof earlier that night, and neighbors later claimed they saw a man taking a block and tackle, used for moving cars, from the Sodders' property before the fire. Telephone lines to the house. Investigators chased down leads and even put up a massive billboard on Route 16, displaying the children's photographs and offering a reward. The billboard stood for nearly 40 years, a haunting reminder of the unanswered questions surrounding that Christmas Eve. Despite the family's efforts, no definitive evidence ever surfaced. The official stance remained that the children had perished in the fire. But the lack of remains and the many anomalies kept speculation alive. The Sodder case became more than a local tragedy. It became a symbol of unresolved grief and the relentless human need for answers. Today, the mystery still lingers. Were the Sodder children victims of a tragic fire? Their remains lost to chance and circumstance? Or were they taken, their lives unfolding somewhere far from the hills of West Virginia? Without proof, the case sits at the crossroads of tragedy and possibility, drawing new generations into its unsolved depths. And while the Sodders searched for closure, another aviation mystery not far from their region would deepen America's fascination with disappearances, when a fully loaded passenger plane vanished over Lake Michigan and left behind questions that remain unsolved to this day. 12. Northwest Orient Flight 2501, 1950. On the evening of June 23, 1950, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 lifted off from New York City, bound for Seattle,
with a scheduled stop in Minneapolis. The aircraft, a Douglas DC-4, carried 55 passengers and 3 crew members. For most of its journey, the flight appeared routine. But somewhere over Lake Michigan, in the darkness of a stormy night, the plane vanished from radar and radio contact. By morning, only small fragments and an oil slick were found floating on the lake's surface. The rest of the aircraft and the bodies of its 58 occupants have never been recovered. It remains one of the most haunting unsolved air disasters in American history. The sequence of events leading to the disappearance suggests a combination of bad weather and navigational difficulties. Around midnight, as the DC-4 approached the lake, the pilot requested permission to descend from 3,500 to 2,500 feet to avoid turbulence. Air traffic controllers denied the request because other planes were in the area. Moments later, contact with Flight 2501 was lost. Search efforts began immediately, but the plane seemed to have simply disappeared. The following day, Coast Guard and Navy searchers recovered floating debris, seat cushions, pieces of upholstery, fragments of clothing, and a few human remains washed ashore. Yet the main wreckage was never located. The absence of large pieces baffled investigators. Typically, even in catastrophic crashes, major sections of fuselage or engines can be recovered. Here, nothing substantial was found, leading some to wonder if the plane had broken apart at altitude, scattering debris too widely to track. The official investigation concluded that Flight 2501 likely encountered severe weather and turbulence over Lake Michigan, causing the pilot to lose control and crash. Thunderstorms had been recorded in the area that night, with reports of violent winds. Still, the lack of physical evidence made it impossible to state with certainty what went wrong. Over the decades, attempts to solve the mystery have continued. In the early 2000s, the families of the victims, the lack of closure has been especially painful. Without wreckage or remains, many relatives lived for years with unanswered questions. Memorials have since been established in Michigan, ensuring the lives lost are not forgotten. The case of Flight 2501 highlights the difficulties of mid-20th century air travel, when aviation had become increasingly common, but still faced limitations in technology and safety. It also stands as a sobering reminder of the vastness of Lake Michigan, a body of water capable of keeping its secrets for generations. And as investigators and families grappled with this mystery, another aviation tragedy just a few years later, again over the Pacific, would leave experts puzzled, when a luxurious passenger flight known as the Romance of the Skies vanished under enigmatic circumstances. 13. Pan Am Flight 7, Romance of the Skies, 1957. On November 8, 1957, Pan American World Airways Flight 7, nicknamed the Romance of the Skies, departed San Francisco, bound for Honolulu. The aircraft was a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, a double-deck luxury airliner renowned for its spacious interiors and long-range capability. On board were 36 passengers and 8 crew members, including Captain Gordon Brown, a veteran pilot with thousands of flight hours. The journey across the Pacific was a well-traveled route by then, expected to be routine. Yet somewhere between California and Hawaii, the aircraft vanished, leaving behind only scattered wreckage and unanswered questions that persist more than 6 decades later. The flight departed San Francisco in the late afternoon, scheduled to arrive in Honolulu the next morning. The last routine communication from the plane came about 4.5 hours into the trip. Everything seemed normal. No distress call, no sign of difficulty. But when the aircraft failed to make contact with Honolulu controllers at its next expected checkpoint, concern grew. Pan Am launched radio calls, followed by search operations once the aircraft was declared overdue. After hours of searching, Coast Guard and Navy vessels spotted a debris field some 900 miles northeast of Honolulu. Bodies, seat cushions, and pieces of the fuselage floated on the surface of the Pacific. In total, 19 bodies were recovered, but the majority of passengers and crew, along with the main wreckage, were never found. Because the Stratocruiser sank in a remote and deep section of the Pacific, recovery efforts were limited, and investigators had little material evidence to work with. The official inquiry struggled to determine a cause. Autopsies of the recovered victims revealed unusually high levels of carbon monoxide in their blood, suggesting the possibility of a fire or engine malfunction that allowed toxic fumes into the cabin. Yet no direct evidence of fire was found among the debris. Another theory proposed structural failure, perhaps triggered by turbulence or mechanical stress, though the Stratocruiser had a strong safety record overall. Speculation also touched on human factors. From the memory of those connected to it. In later decades, aviation historians and independent researchers revisited the mystery, hoping new insights or technology might shed light on what brought down the romance of the skies. Yet the Pacific Ocean still guards its secrets. And without the wreckage, many key questions remain unanswered. What is especially striking about the Flight 7 mystery is how it echoes other unexplained disappearances of the mid-20th century. Aircraft lost without warning, leaving behind just enough evidence to confirm disaster, but not enough to explain it. For many, it symbolizes the perils of an era when air travel was glamorous, but not yet as reliable or transparent as it would become in later decades. And just as the Pacific claimed this unanswered story, another tragedy, this time closer to home in Philadelphia, would capture the nation's attention in 1957, the case of an unidentified young boy whose discovery shocked the public and whose true story is still not fully known. 14. America's Unknown Child. The Boy in the Box, 1957. In February 1957, a college student wandering through a vacant lot in Philadelphia stumbled upon a cardboard box that appeared discarded and ordinary at first glance. Inside, however, was the body of a small boy, estimated to be between 3 and 6 years old. He was malnourished, covered in bruises, and wrapped in a blanket. The discovery shocked the city, and soon after, the entire nation. Newspapers dubbed him America's Unknown Child, and for more than 6 decades his identity and the circumstances of his death remained one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. Police immediately launched a massive investigation. They photographed the boy and released the images publicly, hoping someone would recognize him. Posters were circulated across Philadelphia, and even gas bills were stamped with his likeness to widen awareness. The boy's fingerprints and footprints were taken, and investigators canvassed hospitals, orphanages, and schools. But no match was ever found. Despite the urgency, no one came forward to claim him. The mystery deepened with every detail. The cardboard box had originally contained a bassinet sold by a local store, narrowing its source, but not identifying its owner. The blanket was traced to a factory that produced thousands like it, making it impossible to pin down its buyer. The boy's haircut appeared recent, done unevenly and crudely, as though by someone untrained. His fingernails were trimmed, suggesting a caretaker of some kind, yet his body bore marks of neglect. Every clue seemed to suggest both care and cruelty, but none pointed to a definitive suspect. As the years passed, theories abounded. Some believed he had been the victim of an abusive household, hidden away and never reported missing. Others speculated he had come from an orphanage or illegal foster arrangement that sought to conceal its existence. A particularly persistent lead pointed to a foster home nearby, but repeated investigations failed to produce proof. Even psychic detectives were consulted, though their claims did little to advance the case. The tragedy linked him to living relatives, though many details of his short life remain obscured. Even with a name, the central question, who killed Joseph and why, remains unresolved.
Authorities have said the investigation is ongoing, but as of now, no definitive answers have been found. The Boy in the Box case resonates because it represents more than a crime. It embodies society's responsibility toward its most vulnerable members. That a child could live, die, and remain unidentified for so long speaks to gaps in community care and the limits of mid-century record-keeping. Today, Joseph's name has restored some dignity, but the mystery of his fate still lingers. And as Philadelphia wrestled with the sadness of an unknown child, another strange death in the 1950s, this time involving a scientist connected to secret government experiments, would open up an entirely different kind of mystery, one steeped in Cold War paranoia and secrecy. 15. Frank Olson's Fall, 1953. In the early morning hours of November 28, 1953, Dr. Frank Olson, a U.S. Army scientist, fell from the window of the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York City. The official ruling was suicide, but the circumstances surrounding his death and his work in one of the Cold War's most secretive programs have turned the case into a decades-long mystery that blends espionage, medical ethics, and questions of government accountability. Olson was a bacteriologist working at Fort Detrick in Maryland, the center of America's biological warfare research. He specialized in the study of airborne diseases and was deeply embedded in classified programs. By the early 1950s, he was also connected to the CIA's covert project known as MK-Ultra, which explored chemical and psychological manipulation, including the effects of LSD. According to declassified documents, Olson had grown increasingly unsettled about aspects of his work, particularly the ways in which research might be used in interrogations or experiments without consent. 9 days before his death, Olson attended a retreat with CIA colleagues at a cabin in Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. It was there, according to later revelations, that he was covertly dosed with LSD as part of an experiment, without his knowledge. Witnesses later said Olson reacted poorly, becoming anxious, disoriented, and increasingly paranoid. In the following days, his behavior grew erratic. He told friends he wanted to leave his job and even hinted that he was troubled by secrets he could no longer keep. When he checked into the Statler Hotel with a CIA handler, Olson was reportedly considering psychiatric treatment. What happened next remains the central puzzle. Around 2:30 a.m., Olson plunged from his hotel window. His CIA colleague claimed to have been asleep at the time, awoken only by the sound of breaking glass. The death was quickly ruled a suicide, and Olson's family was given little information. For 2 decades, that explanation stood. But in the 1970s, amid revelations about CIA abuses during the Church Committee hearings, Olson's story resurfaced. Documents confirmed he had been dosed with. Olson's death was a tragic consequence of psychological stress and the reckless LSD experiment. But critics argue that the agency had both motive and opportunity to eliminate a scientist who knew too much about sensitive programs. The lack of conclusive evidence has ensured the case remains one of the most debated episodes of the Cold War era. Frank Olson's fall embodies a larger anxiety about secrecy and trust in government. Was he a troubled man who took his own life? Or was he a whistleblower, silenced before he could speak? Either way, his death became a symbol of the hidden costs of clandestine programs carried out in the name of national security. And as Americans digested the unsettling possibility of government secrets tied to Olson's case, another headline-grabbing courtroom drama just a year later would stir similar debates about truth, guilt, and justice: the controversial murder trial of Dr. Sam Sheppard. 16. Dr. Sam Sheppard Case, 1954. On July 4, 1954, a prominent Ohio doctor named Sam Sheppard awoke in his suburban Cleveland home to a nightmare that would consume the rest of his life and become one of the most famous and controversial criminal cases in American history. His pregnant wife Marilyn had been found brutally beaten in their bedroom, while Sheppard himself claimed to have been attacked by a mysterious, bushy-haired man who fled the house. What followed was a whirlwind of investigation, sensational media coverage, and courtroom drama. Decades later, the case still sparks debate over whether Sheppard was guilty or the victim of one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice in modern times. From the outset, Sheppard's story seemed extraordinary. He told police he had fallen asleep on the family's downstairs couch and was later awakened by his wife's cries. Rushing upstairs, he claimed to have struggled with an intruder who then knocked him unconscious. When he awoke, he found Marilyn dead. Their 7-year-old son, Sam Reese, had been asleep in a nearby room, but was unharmed. Investigators, however, quickly grew suspicious. They noted inconsistencies in Sheppard's account and were troubled by his refusal to submit fully to questioning without an attorney. At the same time, the case was being tried in the court of public opinion. Local newspapers plastered sensational headlines on their front pages, calling for Sheppard's arrest and casting doubt on his story. Reporters camped outside the family home, and the coverage grew so pervasive that it created an atmosphere of near hysteria. By late July, Sheppard was formally charged with his wife's murder. His trial began in October and unfolded more like a media spectacle than a sober legal proceeding. The courtroom was packed with journalists, and coverage often blurred the line between reporting and editorializing. Prosecutors painted Sheppard as an unfaithful husband motivated by marital tensions, while his defense struggled to counter the tide of negative publicity. In December 1954, Sheppard was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Lingered. For the rest of his life, Sheppard lived under the shadow of suspicion. He struggled to rebuild his medical career, endured further personal turmoil, and died in 1970, never fully free of controversy. The mystery resurfaced in the 1990s when Sheppard's son, convinced of his father's innocence, pushed for modern DNA testing on evidence from the crime scene. The results showed that bloodstains in the bedroom did not match either Sam or Marilyn Sheppard, lending support to the intruder theory. Still, prosecutors argued that the tests did not conclusively prove Sheppard's innocence, and the case remains officially unresolved. The Sheppard saga is often cited as a cautionary tale about media influence in the justice system. It even inspired popular culture. The television series The Fugitive and the later film adaptation drew on the story of a man wrongly accused of his wife's murder. To this day, the question remains: was Dr. Sam Sheppard a killer who escaped justice at his second trial, or a man destroyed by a flawed legal process and a sensationalist press? The absence of clear answers keeps the case alive in American memory, and just a decade later, another shocking murder in the nation's capital would echo the same themes of mystery, speculation, and unanswered questions. The unsolved killing of Mary Pinchot Meyer, a woman with close ties to President John F. Kennedy. 17. Mary Pinchot Meyer, 1964. On the crisp afternoon of October 12, 1964, a woman was walking along the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal towpath in Washington, D.C., when she was shot twice at close range. Passers-by heard the gunfire and found her body moments later, but the killer had already vanished. The victim was Mary Pinchot Meyer, a well-connected socialite, artist, and former wife of high-ranking CIA official Cord Meyer. At the time of her death, she was also known as a close confidant and, many believe, a lover of President John F. Kennedy, who had been assassinated less than a year earlier. Her murder shocked the Capitol, and its unresolved nature has since made it one of the most intriguing unsolved mysteries of the 1960s. Mary Meyer was no ordinary Washington socialite. Educated, outspoken, and deeply engaged in politics, she moved in elite circles and often mingled with journalists, diplomats, and government insiders. After divorcing Cord Meyer in 1958, she continued to raise their children while also pursuing her painting career. She became a frequent guest at the Kennedy White House, and several friends later suggested she and the president had a romantic relationship. Some even claimed she encouraged Kennedy to experiment with new ways of thinking during his presidency, including spiritual practices and, controversially, the use of psychedelic substances. When Meyer was killed, suspicion immediately fell on a man named Ray Crump, who was found near the scene, wet and disheveled, apparently having fallen into the canal. Crump, an African-American laborer, denied involvement, claiming he had been fishing and slipped into the water. Witnesses described the killer as a stocky man in a light-colored jacket, but the descriptions were vague. No weapon was ever recovered. Crump was charged with the murder, and his trial became a focal point for the city. The prosecution's case was weak. No forensic evidence linked Crump to the crime, and witnesses could not definitively identify him as the shooter. His defense attorney, Dovey Johnson Roundtree, one of the few black female lawyers practicing at the time, delivered a powerful argument that dismantled the prosecution's circumstantial evidence. After a Kennedy confidant, James Truitt, the diary contained reflections on her life and her relationship with Kennedy. It was said to have been retrieved by her friend Anne Truitt and later destroyed at the request of her sister, artist Toni Pinchot Bradley, with CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton allegedly involved in its recovery. The missing diary has become a story in itself, fueling decades of speculation about whether it contained sensitive revelations. For many, Mary Meyer's murder sits at the crossroads of coincidence and conspiracy. Was she simply the victim of a random act of violence on a public path, killed by an unknown assailant who slipped away undetected? Or was she silenced because of who she was, who she knew, and what she might have revealed? The lack of closure ensures that every theory, from the mundane to the sinister, remains on the table. Her story underscores how certain cases, because of the personalities involved and the timing, become something larger than themselves. Mary Meyer was not just another murder victim. She was a figure whose life touched the highest levels of American power. Her unsolved death has become part of the broader narrative of secrecy and suspicion that defined much of the 1960s. And as Washington struggled with unanswered questions about Meyer's fate, Hollywood was rocked just 2 years earlier by another loss surrounded in mystery: the sudden death of Marilyn Monroe, whose official cause remains debated to this day. 18. Marilyn Monroe, 1962. On the night of August 4th, 1962, the world lost one of its brightest stars when Marilyn Monroe was found lifeless in her Brentwood, California home at the age of 36. Officially, the cause was ruled a probable suicide by barbiturate overdose. Yet from the very beginning, inconsistencies and unanswered questions have fueled one of the most enduring mysteries in American cultural history. Monroe's tragic death remains the subject of speculation, not only because of her immense fame, but also because of her connections to politics, Hollywood power, and her often hidden personal struggles. Marilyn Monroe, born Norma Jean Mortensen, had risen from a difficult childhood to become the very symbol of Hollywood glamour. By the early 1960s, however, her life was anything but charmed. Professionally, she battled with studios and had been labeled difficult for her absences and illnesses. Personally, she struggled with insomnia, anxiety, and dependence on prescription drugs. Still, she was in the middle of career changes. She had just signed new contracts and was rumored to be exploring new projects, suggesting that she was far from ready to abandon her future. The events of her final evening remained debated. Monroe had spoken on the phone to several friends and colleagues, including actor Peter Lawford, who later said she sounded odd before abruptly ending the call. Around midnight, her housekeeper noticed her bedroom light was still on, but received no response when knocking. By 3:30 a.m., police were called, and Monroe was found lying on her bed, holding a telephone receiver. Bottles of pills were nearby. The autopsy revealed high levels of barbiturates in her system, consistent with an overdose. Investigators ruled the case as a probable suicide, citing her history of depression and previous overdoses. To many, this seems straightforward. A beloved but troubled star, overwhelmed by pressures and personal demons. But others immediately questioned the narrative.
One major inconsistency lay in the handling of the scene. Reports differed on who first discovered Monroe's body and at what time. Some claimed silencing by political operatives. Each gained traction at different times, particularly when new witnesses came forward or old files were re-examined. Yet none has ever definitively overturned the original ruling. Marilyn Monroe's death continues to fascinate because it feels emblematic of her life. She was adored by millions, yet often alone. Surrounded by fame, yet vulnerable to forces beyond her control. The mystery endures not simply because of unanswered questions, but because her story resonates with themes of ambition, fragility, and the cost of stardom in mid-century America. What remains is a legacy both luminous and shadowed. Monroe's films, photographs, and public persona still shine, but her final hours remain clouded by uncertainty. Was it despair, accident, or something more hidden? The lack of resolution ensures that her death remains one of America's great unsolved mysteries. And as Hollywood mourned Monroe, another figure tied to the entertainment world would die under equally strange circumstances just a few years later. The television actor George Reeves, best known for playing Superman, whose death raised questions that still linger today. 19. George Reeves, 1959. In the early morning hours of June 16, 1959, George Reeves, the actor best known for portraying Superman in the popular 1950s television series Adventures of Superman, was found dead in his Benedict Canyon home in Los Angeles. He was 45 years old. The official cause was ruled suicide by gunshot. Yet almost immediately, rumors and doubts swirled around the circumstances of his death. Friends, fans, and investigators noted inconsistencies in the evidence. And to this day, Reeves' passing remains one of Hollywood's most enduring unsolved mysteries. George Reeves had been both blessed and burdened by his Superman role. On one hand, it brought him fame and recognition, particularly with younger audiences who saw him as a heroic figure. On the other, it typecast him, limiting opportunities in film and stage work. By 1959, Reeves was frustrated with his career trajectory. Though he was still financially secure and had projects in discussion, he was also preparing to marry Leonore Lemon, a New York socialite, which gave him personal reasons to look forward. These details complicated the narrative that he had taken his own life out of despair. The events of that night were confusing from the outset. Reeves had hosted a small gathering at his home, which included Lemon and several friends. According to accounts, after some drinking and socializing, Reeves went upstairs to his bedroom, while others remained in the living room. Moments later, a gunshot rang out. Guests rushed upstairs to find Reeves dead on the bed, a Luger pistol on the floor nearby. The official police report concluded it was suicide. Reeves had been drinking, and there was no evidence of forced entry. His career frustrations were cited as a possible motive. Yet, questions arose almost immediately. No fingerprints were found on the gun, an unusual oversight for a self-inflicted shooting. Gunpowder residue tests were not conducted on Reeves' hands. Witness statements conflicted, with some suggesting there was a delay before police were called. Speculation grew in multiple directions. Reeves' case alive is its mixture of celebrity, conflicting evidence, and the cultural impact of Superman. Reeves was a man who embodied hope for millions of children, yet his death left only confusion. Was it despair that led him to pull the trigger? Or was there something more sinister behind closed doors that night? For historians and fans alike, the lack of closure has become part of the story itself. The Superman curse, a phrase later coined to describe the misfortunes of actors linked to the role, was partly born from Reeves's tragic fate. Yet beyond the myths, a real man's death remains unresolved. And just a few years later, Americans would be gripped by another story of escape and survival, or perhaps death, when 3 men broke free from the most notorious prison in the country, Alcatraz, and disappeared into the San Francisco Bay, leaving the world to wonder if they made it to freedom.
20. The 1962 Alcatraz escape. On the night of June 11, 1962, 3 prisoners at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, Frank Morris and brothers Clarence and John Anglin, slipped out of their cells and vanished into the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. Known as the Rock, Alcatraz had been designed as the ultimate maximum security prison, housing some of America's most dangerous criminals. Authorities had long insisted it was escape-proof, yet these 3 men, armed only with ingenuity and determination, staged one of the most daring prison breaks in U.S. history. Their ultimate fate remains unknown, making the Alcatraz escape one of the most debated mysteries of the 20th century. The plan had taken months to prepare. Using crude tools fashioned from spoons and other prison-issued items, the men slowly chipped away at the walls of their cells, widening ventilation ducts until they were large enough to crawl through. To muffle the noise, they timed their digging with the roar of prison music hours. Behind the cells, they built a hidden workshop where they assembled their escape gear. Raincoats were stitched together to create a makeshift raft, and life vests, papier-mâché dummy heads, complete with paint and real human hair, were crafted to fool guards during nighttime bed checks. On the chosen night, the men placed the decoy heads on their pillows, crawled through the holes in their cells, and climbed to the roof. From there, they made their way down a utility corridor and launched their raft into the frigid waters of the bay. By morning, when guards conducted routine checks, they discovered the empty cells and the clever ruses that had concealed the escape. The discovery sparked a massive manhunt. The FBI, Coast Guard, and local police scoured the island and the waters beyond. Pieces of the raft and some personal belongings were later found washed up on nearby Angel Island and the Marin shoreline. Yet the escapees themselves were never located. The official investigation concluded that the men likely drowned in the strong currents and cold temperatures of the bay. The report noted that debris found in the water suggested the raft did not hold up, but doubts persisted. The authenticity remains disputed. For the families of the escapees, the mystery became personal. The Anglin family in particular has long insisted that Clarence and John survived. They point to Christmas cards, photographs, and even whispered phone calls as evidence, though none of it has been definitively proven. The Alcatraz escape endures because it embodies both the ingenuity of the human spirit and the limits of authority. Did Morris and the Anglin brothers beat the odds, outsmarting what was billed as the most secure prison in America? Or did the Bay claim their lives, as the FBI has long maintained? Without conclusive evidence, both possibilities remain alive. And while this daring escape kept the nation guessing, another chilling case unfolding in the same decade would leave its own questions unresolved. When Boston was terrorized by a string of murders attributed to the so-called Boston Strangler, whose true identity is still debated today. 21. The Boston Strangler, 1962 to 1964. Between 1962 and 1964, Boston, Massachusetts was gripped by fear as a series of murders terrified the city's residents, particularly women living alone. The case would eventually become synonymous with the name the Boston Strangler. Yet to this day, debate continues over whether one man was truly responsible, or if the crimes were the work of multiple killers. Officially, Albert DeSalvo confessed to the murders, but doubts about his involvement linger, leaving this case one of America's most enduring criminal mysteries. The wave of killings began in June 1962, when a 55-year-old woman was found dead in her Boston apartment. Over the following 2 years, at least 11 more women, ranging in age from 19 to 85, were murdered in similar circumstances. Many of the victims were discovered in their own homes, often with no sign of forced entry, leading investigators to believe the killer had either been allowed in willingly or was skilled at gaining entry. The crime scenes showed disturbing similarities, and newspapers quickly sensationalized the case, branding the unknown assailant as the Strangler.
Fear spread rapidly across Boston. Women began double-locking their doors, refusing to open them even to delivery men or repair workers. Neighborhood watch groups sprang up, and the police presence increased dramatically. Despite this, the murders continued, each one deepening the panic. For law enforcement, the case was confounding. Unlike many serial crimes, the victims did not fit a single profile. They were young and old, wealthy and working class, from various ethnic and social backgrounds. The diversity of the victims made it difficult to establish a clear motive or pattern. In 1964, the killings appeared to stop, as abruptly as they had begun. 2 years later, a break seemed to come from an unexpected source. A man named Albert DeSalvo, already in custody for unrelated crimes, including a series of sexual assaults. DeSalvo confessed in detail to being the Boston Strangler, describing how he committed each murder. His testimony was compelling. He knew facts that were not widely publicized, and he spoke with apparent remained unresolved. Was DeSalvo responsible for all the murders, or were some the work of copycats or entirely different perpetrators? The uncertainty has left the case in a gray zone. On the one hand, DeSalvo's confession and the DNA link suggest he was involved. On the other, the inconsistencies and the diversity of the victims leave open the possibility that Boston's wave of murders was not the work of a single man. For historians and criminologists, the case highlights the challenges of mid-20th century forensic science and the dangers of over-reliance on confessions. The Boston Strangler mystery endures not only because of its brutality, but because it reflects broader anxieties of the era. In a city known for its close-knit neighborhoods, the idea that an unknown predator could move so freely and perhaps never be fully identified was deeply unsettling. Even today, the case is revisited in books, films, and documentaries, each probing the question, was Albert DeSalvo truly the Boston Strangler? Or was the real story more complicated? And just as Boston wrestled with unanswered questions, another series of strange events in the early 1950s had already raised national alarm. This time not about a killer, but about unexplained lights and radar sightings over the nation's capital, in what became one of America's most famous UFO incidents. 22. Flying saucers over Washington, D.C., 1952. In the summer of 1952, the nation's capital became the unexpected stage for one of the most dramatic and widely reported UFO incidents in American history. Over 2 weekends in late July, multiple objects were observed visually and detected on radar over Washington, D.C., including restricted airspace near the White House and the Capitol. The events caused panic among citizens, sparked serious questions in Congress, and forced the U.S. Air Force to hold one of its largest press conferences since World War II. To this day, the Washington Flap, as it came to be known, remains a cornerstone of UFO lore and an enduring, unsolved mystery. The sightings began on the night of July 19, 1952, when air traffic controllers at Washington National Airport noticed several unidentified blips on their radar screens. At first, the operators thought it might be a malfunction, but nearby Andrews Air Force Base reported similar contacts. Soon after, commercial pilots flying in the area reported strange lights in the sky, describing them as glowing orbs moving erratically at high speeds, unlike any known aircraft. Some lights hovered motionless before darting away at impossible angles, behavior that radar confirmed. For hours, the strange objects appeared, disappeared, and reappeared over the city. Fighter jets were scrambled to intercept them. But whenever the pilots approached, the lights vanished, only to return once the jets departed. This frustrating pattern would repeat the following weekend, on July 26th through 27th, when radar operators and pilots once again tracked multiple fast-moving objects over Washington. Airline crews described brilliant white lights streaking across the sky, while one jet pilot reported seeing a formation of glowing objects before they zipped out of view.
By the end of the second weekend, the story had spread nationwide. Headlines proclaimed, "Saucers swarm over Capitol," and speculation ran wild. In the middle of the Cold War, with tensions against the Soviet Union high, some Americans feared the lights represented advanced enemy technology. Others embraced the idea that they might be extraterrestrial spacecraft. Returns behave in such a coordinated way. Pilots likewise dismissed the idea that stars or meteors could account for the bright, maneuvering lights they witnessed. The persistence of the sightings over 2 weekends, corroborated by both radar and visual observers, suggested that something more unusual had occurred. To calm public concern, the Air Force held a major press conference on July 29, 1952. Officials repeated their weather inversion explanation and insisted there was no evidence of hostile aircraft or extraterrestrial craft. The press conference helped reduce panic, but it did not end speculation. In fact, it may have fueled it. Many Americans suspected the military knew more than it was admitting. Over time, the Washington sightings became a focal point for UFO researchers. Skeptics continued to argue that temperature inversions and human misperception were sufficient explanations. Believers countered that the combination of radar confirmation, pilot testimony, and multiple independent witnesses made the case one of the strongest on record. Some even suggested the sudden disappearance of the objects whenever jets approached indicated intelligent control, whether human or otherwise. The Washington flap also influenced government policy. Concerned about growing public fascination with UFOs and the potential for hysteria, the CIA convened the Robertson Panel in 1953. This advisory group recommended downplaying UFO reports and encouraging media debunking to prevent the issue from overwhelming defense systems or creating panic. In effect, the Washington sightings helped solidify the U.S. government's policy of treating UFOs as a public relations problem rather than a defense issue. Decades later, the mystery endures. Advances in radar and atmospheric science have provided more insight into how false targets might appear. But even modern experts acknowledge that not all aspects of the 1952 sightings are easily explained. The accounts of experienced pilots and controllers continue to resist simple dismissal. For UFO historians, the Washington flap stands alongside Roswell as one of the defining unsolved cases of mid-20th century America. The events also highlight the cultural mood of the era. In the 1950s, Americans lived under constant anxiety of nuclear war and foreign. 23. Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, 1965. On the evening of December 9, 1965, residents of a small Pennsylvania town witnessed something extraordinary. A fireball streaked across the skies of several U.S. states and parts of Canada, ultimately appearing to come down near Kecksburg, a rural community about 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Witnesses described seeing a glowing object descend into the woods, followed quickly by a heavy military presence. What followed has become one of the most enduring, unsolved mysteries of the Cold War era, often described as Pennsylvania's Roswell. The event began shortly after 4:45 p.m., when reports of a bright object were logged from Michigan to Ontario. Astronomers initially classified it as a meteor entering the Earth's atmosphere, a fairly common occurrence, though rarely so widely observed. But in Kecksburg, the story took a stranger turn. Dozens of locals claimed that something more than a meteor fell that night. Several said they saw an object maneuvering before it crashed into a wooded ravine. Children who rushed to the site described a large metallic craft partially buried in the ground. According to some accounts, it was shaped like an acorn, about the size of a car, and bore unusual markings around its base, symbols that resembled hieroglyphs. Within hours, military personnel arrived, sealing off the area. Witnesses recalled jeeps, trucks, and uniformed men moving through the woods with flashlights. Local fire crews who initially responded were reportedly ordered away. By late evening, the site was cordoned off, and by nightfall, flatbed trucks were seen leaving the area, some covered with tarps. The next day, the official explanation was simple. Nothing had been found.
The U.S. government declared that a meteor had likely burned up in the atmosphere, leaving no debris. For locals who had seen the military activity firsthand, the denial fueled suspicion that something unusual had indeed been recovered. Theories about what fell in Kecksburg have proliferated ever since. Some believe it was a Soviet satellite, possibly Cosmos-like unsolved mysteries have revisited Kecksburg. In 2003, NASA was sued under the Freedom of Information Act to release documents about the incident. The agency initially admitted it had records, but later stated that they had been misplaced, a response that only deepened public mistrust. To this day, no official files have provided a definitive answer about what was recovered. The Kecksburg incident endures, partly because it taps into themes that defined the 1960s: Cold War secrecy, rapid technological advancement, and public fascination with space. The decade was filled with both genuine scientific achievements, like the Apollo missions, and rumors of hidden government projects. Against this backdrop, the idea that an unusual object might have fallen from the sky into a Pennsylvania forest felt both possible and deeply unsettling. For the people of Kecksburg, the mystery has become part of local identity. Each year, the town hosts a festival commemorating the event, and the community even built a replica of the acorn-shaped craft, described by eyewitnesses. What began as a frightening, confusing night has transformed into folklore, an enduring reminder of how quickly an unexplained event can shape culture and memory. Yet, even as Kecksburg held on to its mystery, the late 1960s brought another case, darker and far more menacing, that gripped the entire nation. In Northern California, a killer emerged who taunted police and newspapers with letters, ciphers, and threats, leaving behind a trail of terror and unanswered questions. The world would come to know him as the Zodiac. 24. The Zodiac Killer, 1968 to 1969. In the late 1960s, Northern California became the hunting ground for one of the most infamous, unidentified criminals in American history, the Zodiac Killer. Between 1968 and 1969, at least 5 murders, though the killer claimed many more, were linked to this shadowy figure who not only attacked victims, but also taunted police and the public with letters, cryptograms, and threats. Despite decades of investigation, countless suspects, and even breakthroughs in forensic science, the Zodiac's identity has never been confirmed, making this case one of the most enduring mysteries in U.S. criminal history. The Zodiac's confirmed crimes began on December 20th, 1968, when high school students Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday were shot and killed on a lover's lane in Vallejo, California. Just over 6 months later, on July 4th, 1969, another couple, Darlene Ferrin and Mike Pinchot, were attacked while parked in a car at Blue Rock Springs, also near Vallejo. Ferrin was killed. Pinchot survived despite serious injuries, and soon after, a chilling phone call was made to the police by someone claiming responsibility for both crimes. Then, in August 1969, 3 San Francisco Bay Area newspapers received nearly identical letters from someone calling himself the Zodiac. Each letter began with the same phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." Accompanying the letters were coded ciphers filled with symbols, letters, and shapes. The writer demanded that the ciphers be published on the front pages of the papers, warning that failure to comply would result in more deaths. Within days, amateur cryptographers cracked the first cipher, which contained disturbing statements about killing being his chosen game. However, it provided no clear clues about the writer's identity. The killings continued. On September 27, 1969, college students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Sheppard were picnicking at Lake Berryessa when a hooded man approached, brandishing a weapon. Culture and astrology. He claimed dozens of victims,
though investigators could only conclusively link him to the 5 murders already mentioned. Some of his ciphers remained unbroken for decades, with one, the so-called 340 cipher, finally solved by amateur cryptographers in 2020. That solution revealed rambling boasts, but, again, no identification. The investigation into the Zodiac drew in multiple police departments, the FBI, and countless amateur sleuths. Suspects included school teachers, ex-cons, and even journalists. One of the most prominent suspects was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester who matched several witness descriptions and owned items similar to those described in the case, yet no conclusive evidence ever tied him to the crimes. His DNA, later tested against saliva on Zodiac stamps, did not match. What makes the Zodiac case so haunting is not just the brutality of the crimes, but the killer's ability to manipulate public fear. He turned his murders into a media spectacle, playing a game of cat and mouse with law enforcement. His use of cryptography, his flair for publicity, and his unpredictability created a chilling sense that he could strike anywhere, anytime. Decades later, the case remains officially open. DNA testing has advanced, but many of the original letters may have been contaminated over time, complicating analysis. New suspects continue to emerge in books and documentaries, each with circumstantial evidence, but no definitive proof. The Zodiac has become as much a cultural figure as a criminal, inspiring films, novels, and endless speculation. For the families of victims, however, the lack of closure is not a puzzle to be solved for entertainment, but a lasting wound. The hope that one day science or a long-lost confession might provide answers keeps the case alive. Until then, the Zodiac remains a phantom of American crime, a reminder of how mystery and fear can transcend generations. And just as Northern California was gripped by the terror of the Zodiac, another tragedy unfolded that same year beneath the waves of the Atlantic. The mysterious loss of a U.S. nuclear submarine, the USS Scorpion, whose sinking raised troubling questions that remain unresolved to this day. 25. USS Scorpion, SSN 589, sinks, 1968. On May 22, 1968, the USS Scorpion, a nuclear-powered submarine of the United States Navy, failed to arrive at its scheduled port in Norfolk, Virginia. With 99 officers and crewmen aboard, the submarine had been returning from a 3-month deployment in the Mediterranean. After several days of silence, the Navy declared the submarine missing. A frantic search began, involving ships, aircraft, and intelligence resources. Weeks later, wreckage was located on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, about 400 miles southwest of the Azores. But even after its discovery, questions about why the Scorpion sank and whether it was a simple mechanical failure, a design flaw, or something more sinister, have never been conclusively answered. The Scorpion was one of the Skipjack-class submarines, among the fastest and most advanced in the Navy's fleet at the time. By the late 1960s, however, the U.S. submarine force was under pressure. The Cold War with the Soviet Union was at its height, and nuclear submarines were vital to projecting power and surveillance. The Scorpion's mission had included monitoring Soviet naval activity in the Mediterranean. Some reports later suggested it had been shadowing Soviet submarines and surface vessels closely before setting course for home. What is known about its final days comes from fragments of communications. The Scorpion reported minor equipment issues earlier in its voyage, but nothing alarming. Its last radio message, sent on May 21st, indicated that it was about to begin surveillance of a Soviet task group near the Azores. The next day, it disappeared without distress signals. When the wreck was located months later by deep-sea exploration equipment, investigators found it in several pieces scattered across the seabed at a depth of about 10,000 feet. The hull showed signs of implosion under immense pressure. The Navy concluded that the submarine had been lost suddenly, likely due to flooding or mechanical failure that caused it to sink below crush depth. But specifics remained elusive. The official explanation emphasized a possible torpedo malfunction, one theory to confirm Soviet involvement. Both American and Soviet officials publicly denied the idea, though suspicions lingered. Adding to the mystery is the secrecy surrounding Navy investigations. Several official reports were classified for decades, and when portions were released, they raised almost as many questions as they answered. Crew families complained of being kept in the dark, told only vague explanations about probable equipment failure. The lack of transparency led some to suspect a cover-up, whether to hide embarrassing design flaws in the fleet or to avoid admitting to a Cold War confrontation at sea. The Scorpion's loss was not an isolated event. Remarkably, 1968 saw the sinking of 4 submarines worldwide. 2 Soviet subs, the French Minerve and the Israeli Dakar, in addition to the Scorpion. For naval historians, this coincidence underscores both the risks of submarine technology at the time and the intensity of Cold War undersea operations. In later decades, advances in undersea exploration allowed more detailed photographs of the wreck. These images showed the submarine's hull crushed inward, consistent with an implosion caused by flooding or loss of control. Yet the photographs could not definitively confirm whether the initiating cause was mechanical failure, human error, or external attack. As late as the 1990s and 2000s, former Navy officers and independent researchers continued to push for greater disclosure, but the mystery has never been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. For the families of the 99 sailors lost, the tragedy remains deeply personal. Memorials stand today in Norfolk and Arlington National Cemetery, honoring their service and sacrifice. But the absence of definitive answers has left an enduring wound. To this day, the USS Scorpion is remembered not only as a Cold War casualty, but also as a symbol of unanswered questions at the intersection of secrecy, technology, and global rivalry. And with the Scorpion's loss, our journey through these 25 American mysteries reaches its end. Yet, like so many of the stories before, it closes not with certainty, but with lingering doubt. Each case reminds us that history